Nadia heard Ezra laughing before she even opened her eyes. It was that deep, belly kind of laugh. The kind that used to fill their old apartment on Sunday mornings, when she'd make pancakes shaped like dinosaurs, and he'd pretend they were scary. That laugh used to be her favorite sound in the entire world. But it was 3 a.m. and Ezra was supposed to be asleep. She sat up slowly, her heart already doing something wrong in her chest. The house was dark, the kind of dark that feels heavy, like it has weight, like it's pressing down on you from every direction. She could hear the old pipes groaning somewhere beneath the floorboards. She could hear the wind dragging itself across the roof, and underneath all of it, she could hear her son, laughing, talking, whispering, to something she couldn't see. She got up. Her feet hit the cold floor. She moved down the hallway toward his room, and with every step, that laugh got a little different, a little slower, a little lower, like it wasn't quite his anymore. She pushed open his door. Ezra was sitting in the corner of his room, facing the wall, rocking back and forth. His small shoulders were shaking, and on the wall in front of him, drawn in something dark and wet, that Nadia prayed wasn't what she thought it was, were 3 names she didn't recognize. And beneath them, a 4th. Ezra. If that just made your stomach drop, and you need to know how a mother and her son ended up in that house with whatever is hiding inside those walls, hit that like button right now and subscribe to the Dark Chronicles, because this story is going to take you somewhere you won't be able to shake for days. Turn on your notifications too, because you don't want to be left in the dark when the next episode drops. Now let's go back to where this nightmare began. The listing said 4 bedrooms, 1.5 bathrooms, original hardwood floors throughout, and a private backyard backing onto a tree line. It said motivated seller. It said priced to move quickly. What it didn't say was why. Nadia Voss found the listing on a Thursday evening in early October, sitting cross-legged on the floor of her sister's guest bedroom, with her laptop balanced on her knees, and Ezra asleep behind her, curled into a tight ball, the way he always slept when he was stressed. He'd been sleeping like that for 6 months. Since the divorce, since the move out of their apartment, since the world he knew got folded up and put away without anyone asking him if he was ready. She'd been searching for 3 hours. Everything in her budget was either too small, too far from a decent school, or in a neighborhood that made her chest tight when she looked at the street view photos. And then 14 Bellmare Road appeared on the screen and she stopped scrolling. The house was beautiful. That was the first thing. It was the kind of house she used to point at from car windows when she was a little girl. The kind with wide front steps and tall windows and a porch that wrapped around the side like an arm around a shoulder. It sat back from the road on a generous lot with old oak trees that had clearly been there for 100 years at least. In the listing photos, the late afternoon sun hit the front of it in a way that made it glow a warm amber color, and for just a moment, Nadia felt something loosen in her chest that had been knotted tight for half a year. Then she looked at the price and laughed out loud. It was listed at $62,000 for a 4-bedroom house in upstate New York, with original hardwood floors and an acre of land. She actually laughed. Not because it was funny, but because her brain couldn't process it as real information. Houses like that didn't sell for $62,000. Houses like that sold for $400,000, for $600,000, not $62,000. She clicked on the listing details. The house had been on the market for 412 days. It had been reduced 11 times. The previous list price had been $68,000, before that $74,000. All the way back to the original listing price of $140,000 14 months ago, and not a single offer accepted. Not one. She should have closed the laptop right then. Instead, she called the number at the bottom of the listing. The real estate agent's name was Phyllis Karn, and she answered on the second ring with the slightly too eager voice of someone who had been waiting a long time for that particular phone to ring. She confirmed the price. She confirmed the square footage. She confirmed the school district, which was decent. and the property taxes, which were low. She answered every question Nadia asked in a smooth, practiced way that left no room for follow-up. Nadia asked why the house had been on the market for over a year. There was a pause. Short. Barely there. But Nadia caught it. "It's a niche property," Phyllis said. "Rural location. Not everyone wants the upstate lifestyle." It wasn't an answer. But Nadia was tired and desperate, and the house was $62,000, so she let it go. They closed 5 weeks later. The previous owner, a man named Gerald Fitch, who was in his late 70s, and who conducted the entire closing process through his lawyer without ever appearing in person, left behind a set of keys, a handwritten note with the utility company numbers, and almost all of his furniture. Nadia thought that was strange. People didn't usually leave their furniture, but Phyllis said Gerald was moving into assisted living and couldn't take it with him. And once again, Nadia let it go, because the alternative was asking more questions she wasn't sure she wanted answers to. They moved in on a Friday. Nadia rented a small moving truck for the boxes and the few pieces of furniture she'd managed to hold on to after the divorce. Ezra sat in the passenger seat the whole drive up from the city, quiet in that particular way he'd been quiet for months, looking out the window with his chin in his hand, like he was trying to solve a problem too big for a 9-year-old. When they turned onto Bellmare Road, and the house came into view through the truck's windshield, Nadia watched Ezra's face change. It was subtle. She almost missed it. But something in his expression shifted, some tightness around his eyes that she'd been watching for 6 months suddenly went loose, and he sat up straighter in his seat and leaned slightly forward, like the house was pulling him toward it on a string. "It's big," he said quietly. "It's ours," Nadia told him. Ezra didn't say anything else, but he didn't look away from the house until the truck stopped in the driveway. The inside was exactly like the photos, and also nothing like them. The rooms were larger than they'd seemed on screen, with high ceilings that made sounds travel strangely, bouncing off the plaster walls in ways that made the house feel alive with noise, even when it was completely silent. The hardwood floors were dark and smooth, and cold under her feet, even through her socks. The light that came through the tall windows was beautiful, but thin, the kind of light that illuminates without warming, that shows you everything in a room without making any of it feel friendly. Gerald Fitch's furniture sat exactly where he'd left it, a heavy dining table with 6 chairs that nobody had sat in for a long time, a leather armchair in the living room that faced the fireplace, a tall wooden clock in the front hallway that had stopped at 3:17, and that Nadia wound twice in the first hour without it ever starting again. Bookshelves lined with old hardbacks, whose spines she didn't recognize, titles she'd never heard of, some of them in languages she couldn't read. Ezra ran through every room with the kind of energy he hadn't shown in months. She could hear his footsteps above her as she unpacked boxes in the kitchen, running from one end of the upstairs hallway to the other, opening doors, exploring. She heard him go quiet for a long stretch and called his name up the stairs. "I found my room," he called back. She hadn't assigned him a room yet. She'd planned to let him choose. She went up the stairs and found him standing in the doorway of the second bedroom on the right, the one at the end of the hall, the one with the window that looked out over the backyard and the tree line beyond it. He was just standing there, not going in, just looking at it. "You want this one?" Nadia asked. "It already feels like mine," Ezra said. She put it down to kid logic. She helped him set up his bed and his bookshelf and his small desk, and by 9 o'clock he was fed and bathed and tucked in with his lamp on and his door open the way he liked it. She stood in the doorway for a moment, watching him, that small, serious face already going slack with sleep, and she let herself feel, just for a second, that maybe this was going to be okay, that maybe she'd made the right call. Then she went downstairs and found the basement door. It was in the kitchen, set into the wall beside the refrigerator, painted the same cream color as everything else, so that it almost disappeared if you weren't looking for it. It had a keyhole, but no handle, just a flat painted surface, and a lock that required a key she didn't have. She looked through Gerald Fitch's key set twice. Nothing fitted. She made a note to call Phyllis in the morning and went to bed. She didn't sleep well. She told herself it was the new house sounds. Every old house has its own language, its own repertoire of creaks and sighs and settlements that a new occupant has to learn before they stop hearing them as threats. She lay in the dark listening to the house breathe and tried to assign each sound a rational explanation, and mostly succeeded. Mostly. At some point in the deep middle of the night, she heard something beneath the floor. Not the pipes, not the settling of old wood. Something slower, something more deliberate. A sound like something being dragged, very slowly, across a concrete floor. She lay completely still for 4 minutes. Then it stopped. She told herself it was an animal, a raccoon that had gotten into the crawl space. She'd deal with it in the morning. She did not deal with it in the morning, because by morning, she'd half convinced herself she'd dreamed it. The next 3 days were the busy, exhausting work of unpacking and organizing and making a strange space feel like home. She enrolled Ezra in the local elementary school, Harlow Creek Primary, which started the following Monday. She called the utility companies. She bought groceries. She hung curtains. She called Phyllis about the basement key, and Phyllis said she'd asked Gerald's lawyer and never called back. During those 3 days, Nadia met 2 of her neighbors. The first was a woman named Bette Osman, who lived in the white farmhouse 3 lots down, and who brought over a loaf of banana bread on the Saturday morning, with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She stood on the porch and didn't come inside. When Nadia invited her in, Bet looked past her, into the front hallway, with an expression that lasted only a fraction of a second, but that Nadia would think about for a long time afterward. It was the expression of someone looking at something they'd already grieved. "You have a child?" Bet asked. "A son, Ezra. He's 9. Something moved across Bet's face. "How lovely," she said. Her voice was perfectly warm. Her eyes were not. The second neighbor was a man named Cord Phelps, who lived directly across the road, and who didn't bring anything. He came to the edge of his property while Nadia was bringing boxes in from the truck and watched her for a long moment without speaking. When she waved, he nodded slowly. When she called out hello, he said, "You've got kids?" in a voice that had no greeting in it at all. "One son," Nadia said. Cord Phelps looked at the house for a long moment. Then he looked back at her. "I'd get him out of there," he said quietly. And then he turned and walked back inside his house and closed the door. Nadia stood in the driveway, holding a box of kitchen things, and stared at his closed front door for a long time. Then she told herself small towns had strange people in them and went inside. On Sunday evening, the night before Ezra started school, she went upstairs to check on him and found him sitting on the floor of his room with his back against the bed, drawing in his sketchbook. Ezra had always been a drawer. Even as a toddler, he'd covered every surface he could find with his small, urgent lines, always with stories behind them that he'd narrate at full speed if you asked. She leaned against the doorframe and looked at what he was drawing. It was the house, seen from the outside, from the backyard, looking up at his window. He'd captured it with surprising accuracy. The roofline, the tall windows, the oak trees on either side. But in the window of his room, looking out, he'd drawn a figure, small, childlike, standing very still. "Is that you?" Nadia asked. Ezra looked up. Then he looked back at the drawing. "No," he said simply, and closed the sketchbook. She asked him who it was. He said he didn't know. He said it was just a drawing. She told herself it was just a drawing too, and kissed him goodnight, and went downstairs, and stood in the kitchen for a long time looking at the door without a handle beside the refrigerator. On the 8th day, she found something behind the wallpaper in Ezra's room. She'd been meaning to repaint. The wallpaper in his room was old, a faded pattern of small blue diamonds on cream, peeling at the seams in a way that bothered her. She'd started lifting a corner near the window to see how it was attached, whether it would come off cleanly, and a whole section came away in one piece, and underneath it, on the bare plaster wall, were names, written in pencil, in a careful childlike hand. 3 of them, arranged one beneath the other in a neat column. Thomas, age 7, William, age 5, Clara, age 4. And beneath those 3 names, written in a different hand, shockier, harder to read, the handwriting of someone who was either very old or very frightened or both. God forgive me. I tried to stop it. Nadia stood in her son's room with a strip of wallpaper in her hand and read those words 4 times. Then she went very carefully back downstairs, sat at the kitchen table, opened her laptop, and typed the address of the house into the search bar. What came back changed everything. In December of 1962, a woman named Doris Hale had lived at 14 Bellmare Road with her husband Leonard and their 3 children, Thomas, William, and Clara. Within 6 weeks of moving in, all 3 children were dead. The causes of death listed in the newspaper archives Nadia found were different for each child. William had drowned in the bathtub. Clara had fallen from the upstairs landing. Thomas had died in his sleep of causes the coroner had listed, in the clipped language of someone who had run out of rational explanations, as undetermined cardiac event. He was 7 years old. Leonard Hale had left Harlow Creek the week after Thomas died. He'd never come back. He'd never spoken publicly about what happened. Doris Hale had stayed. She'd lived in that house alone for 11 more years. The neighbors at the time described her as a woman who had gone somewhere inside herself that no one could reach. She was seen occasionally in town, buying groceries, getting gas. Always alone, always quiet, always looking like she was listening to something no one else could hear. She died in the house in 1973. The cause of death was listed as natural causes. She was 51 years old. After Doris, the house had passed through 8 different families in the following 50 years. Nadia counted them in the records. 8 families, every single one with children. Every single one that had stayed longer than 2 months had lost a child before they left. Some to accidents, some to illness, some to causes that the records described in the same careful, vague language as Thomas Hale's death. One family, the Drakes, who had lived there in 1987, had lost a daughter named Penny, age 8, to what the coroner had called undetermined neurological failure. Her father had given a single interview to the local paper after they left. The interview was 2 paragraphs long. In the second paragraph, he said something that Nadia read 3 times in a row, her hands very still on the keyboard. "The house wanted her," Raymond Drake had said. "I know how that sounds. I don't care how it sounds. That house wanted my daughter, and it took her. And there's nothing rational I can say about it, because it wasn't rational. It was something else. It was something old and hungry, and it doesn't stop." Nadia sat at the kitchen table in the house at 14 Bellmare Road and read Raymond Drake's words and listened to the silence above her where her son was sleeping and felt the bottom of her world tilt in a way that nothing was ever going to correct. She stood up from the table. She was going to go upstairs. She was going to pack their bags. She was going to put Ezra in the car tonight and drive away from Harlow Creek and never come back and eat the loss of the $62,000, because money could be recovered and her son could not. She was halfway to the stairs when she heard it. Ezra's voice, drifting down from his room above her. Not crying, not scared, laughing. At 11:40 p.m., talking to something she couldn't see. She took the stairs slowly. She moved down the hallway. She put her hand on his door. She pushed it open. Ezra was in bed. He was lying on his side, facing the wall, and he was laughing softly in that low, slow way that had woken her in the hook of this story. The laugh that wasn't quite right. The laugh that belonged to her son, but sounded like it was being used by something else that was still learning how. "Ezra," she said. He went quiet. He rolled over and looked at her with eyes that took a second too long to focus, like he'd come back from somewhere far away. "Go to sleep, Mom," he said. "Who were you talking to?" He blinked, slow. "I was dreaming," he said. He rolled back over and was asleep in less than a minute. Nadia stood in the doorway of his room and looked at the wall behind him and saw, for just a moment, in the thin light coming through the curtains, the faint outline of the names she'd found beneath the wallpaper. Thomas, William, Clara, and the space beneath them that was still empty, but not for long. If you're already feeling the dread crawling up your spine, and you need to know what is living inside that house and what it wants with Ezra, drop the words Bellmare Road in the comments right now and smash that subscribe button, because what Nadia discovers about Doris Hale and the things she left behind in episode 2 is going to stop your blood cold. We are just getting started. Nadia didn't leave that night. She told herself it was because she couldn't wake Ezra at midnight and drag him into a car without frightening him. She told herself it was because she needed a plan, needed to be practical, needed to think clearly before she did anything. She told herself a lot of things standing in the kitchen at midnight with the house pressing in around her and the clock on the wall that had never once ticked reading 3:17 in the dark. The truth was simpler and harder than any of that. She was afraid that if she woke him, he wouldn't want to go. She sat at the kitchen table until 3 in the morning, reading everything she could find about 14 Bellmare Road and Doris Hale and the families who had come after her. The newspaper archives were thin. Harlow Creek's local paper, the Creek Courier, had covered the Hale children's deaths in 1962 with the careful restraint of a community that knew better than to say out loud what it was thinking. 3 children dead in 6 weeks, 3 separate causes, 3 separate investigations that each concluded with the same quiet dead end. The sheriff at the time, a man named Otis Brower, had given one public statement. "We are satisfied that no criminal act was committed," Otis Brower had said. "This family has suffered an unimaginable tragedy, and we ask that their privacy be respected." What Otis Brower had said privately was harder to find, but Nadia found it at 1:43 in the morning in a digitized copy of a letter he'd written to the county medical examiner, a letter that had been included in a document archive from a local historical society that someone had uploaded to a genealogy website years ago, probably without realizing what it contained. In the letter, Otis Brower wrote that he had spoken to Doris Hale 4 times in the weeks following her children's deaths. He wrote that her account of events was consistent each time, which he found notable given her obvious distress. He wrote that she described hearing her children talking in their rooms at night to someone she could not see. He wrote that she described the children becoming, in her word, absorbed. Absorbed in the house, absorbed in something the house contained, less interested in food, in play, in her, more interested in corners and walls and floors, more interested in whatever it was they were talking to that she couldn't see or hear. And then Otis Brower wrote something that made Nadia set down her coffee cup very carefully on the table. He wrote that Doris Hale had told him she believed the house had a hunger in it, that the hunger was old, that it had been there long before the Hales arrived and would be there long after they were gone, that it didn't want the children dead. That dead was not what it wanted at all. "She said it wants to keep them," Otis Brower wrote. "She said it takes pieces of them, not all at once, but slowly, over weeks. She said it takes the pieces that belong to us, to their families, and it keeps those pieces for itself, and when there's nothing left that belongs to us anymore, they stop. She said her children didn't die. She said they were finished." Nadia read those words and sat very still in the kitchen of 14 Bellmare Road and listened to the house around her and thought about her son laughing in the dark at something she couldn't see. She was upstairs checking on him before she was fully aware she'd stood up. He was asleep, genuinely asleep this time, breathing slow and even, his face soft the way it always was when he was under. She stood over him and looked at him for a long time, memorizing the exact way his eyelashes rested on his cheeks the small motion of his chest, the way one hand was tucked under his chin. Then she looked at the wall behind him. The names were there. Faint, but there. She went back to the kitchen and called her sister Mara in the city. It was nearly 2 in the morning, but Mara picked up on the third ring, because that's the kind of sister Mara was. "I need you to come," Nadia said. "What happened?" Mara asked, already awake, already alert. "I'll tell you when you get here. I need you to come tomorrow. I need someone else to be in this house." Mara came the next afternoon, making the drive from the city in just over 3 hours, arriving with an overnight bag and the expression of a woman prepared to take things seriously. Nadia had spent the morning watching Ezra. He'd woken up bright-eyed and calm, eaten his breakfast without complaint, sat at the kitchen table doing homework with a focused quietness she'd come to recognize as his new normal. She'd asked him how he'd slept. "Good," he said. "Really good. I like sleeping here. The house is warm." The house wasn't warm. The radiators in the old heating system were inconsistent at best. That morning, the kitchen had been cold enough that she could see her breath near the window. But Ezra sat at the table in his light cotton pajamas and said the house was warm with complete certainty, and Nadia nodded and said she was glad and watched him over the rim of her coffee cup with a feeling she had no clean word for. Mara arrived and Nadia waited until Ezra was settled in his room before she sat her sister down at the kitchen table and told her everything. The listing price, the history, the names behind the wallpaper, Otis Brower's letter, Raymond Drake's interview, Ezra laughing in the dark, all of it laid out in order, quiet and controlled. Because if she let herself not be controlled, she would fall apart completely, and she couldn't afford that. Mara listened without interrupting. When Nadia finished, Mara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "We need to talk to someone in this town, someone who's been here long enough to know." Cord Phelps was standing at his mailbox when they walked across the road 20 minutes later. He saw them coming and didn't move, just watched them cross with that same still, measured expression he'd had the first day. When they reached him, Nadia said his name, and he nodded. "How long have you lived across from that house?" Mara asked. 31 years, Cord said. "Then you know," Nadia said. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "How long have you been in there?" 11 days. Something shifted in Cord's face. "Your boy," he said. "Has he started talking in his sleep?" The air went cold between them. "Yes," Nadia said. Cord looked past them at the house. He was quiet for long enough that Nadia thought he wasn't going to say anything more. Then he said, "You need to get into the basement." "I don't have a key," Nadia said. "The previous owner, Gerald Fitch, didn't leave the key because he didn't want you to go down there," Cord said. "Gerald Fitch knew exactly what that house was. He'd been its caretaker for 30 years, making sure nobody stayed long enough." He paused. "He slipped up with you. You moved fast, and he's old, and I think he just wanted to be done with it." "What's in the basement?" Mara asked. Cord looked at them both. "Doris Hale's things," he said. "Everything she left behind. Gerald kept it all down there because he said it needed to stay close to the source." He paused again. He said the things she left down there were the only thing keeping it from moving faster. That night, Nadia broke the basement door open with a crowbar she found in the garage. The smell hit her first. Old and deep and damp, like soil that had never seen sunlight. She stood at the top of the stairs with a flashlight and looked down. The stairs were wooden, narrow, steep. The light didn't reach the bottom. She went down. The basement was a single large room with a concrete floor and stone walls that wept moisture in thin, dark lines. There was a bare bulb hanging from the ceiling on a cord, and when Nadia pulled it, it came on with a yellow light that made everything look like it was underwater. Along the far wall, arranged with a care that felt almost ceremonial, were Doris Hale's things. A wooden trunk, a rocking chair, a small table with objects arranged on it that Nadia moved towards slowly, one careful step at a time. On the table there was a Bible with a cracked spine, open to a passage in the book of Exodus that someone had underlined so hard the pen had torn through the page. There was a child's shoe, small, brown leather, and there was a journal, slim and cloth-covered in faded green, with Doris written on the inside cover in a hand that was steady and deliberate, the handwriting of a woman who had something important to say and was determined to say it clearly. Nadia took the journal. She sat on the cold basement floor and she read it. Doris Hale had moved into the house in October of 1962 with Leonard and their 3 children. She'd loved the house immediately. She wrote about the oak trees and the wide front porch and the way the light came through the tall windows in the afternoon. She wrote about Thomas and his love of birds, William and his fear of thunder, Clara and her habit of collecting interesting rocks and arranging them by color. She wrote like a woman who was happy, who had found the place she was supposed to be. And then, around the 3rd week, the entries changed. She wrote about Thomas talking in his sleep. She wrote about finding William sitting in the corner of his room at odd hours, calm and quiet, staring at the wall, with an expression she described as peaceful in a way that frightened me. She wrote about Clara stopping her habit of collecting rocks, stopping most of her habits, becoming a child who sat still and looked inward, who seemed to be listening to a frequency no one else could access. She wrote about going to the church in town and speaking to the pastor, a man she called Reverend Aldous, who had listened to her with an expression that told her he'd heard some version of this before. He'd told her to leave the house, just leave. She'd told him she had nowhere to go and no money to get there, and a husband who thought she was having a breakdown. Reverend Aldous had pressed her hands between both of his and looked at her with an expression she described as the saddest thing I have ever seen on a human face, and said, "Then you must find a way to make it sleep. Make it sleep." She wrote about spending 2 weeks researching, about driving to the county library, about finding fragments of local history that described the land the house sat on, land that had been avoided by the indigenous people of the region for reasons that white settlers hadn't bothered to understand before building on it. She wrote about an account from 1887 of a farmhand who had worked the property and who had described hearing children's voices in the fields at night when no children were present. She wrote about the slow dawning understanding that whatever was in that house was not new, was not connected to any one event or tragedy, was simply old and hungry and perfectly patient. And then she wrote about what she had tried to do to stop it. She wrote about the objects she'd assembled and placed in the basement, about the prayers she'd said over them, the specific combination of things that Reverend Aldous had found in an old text and passed to her through a brown paper envelope left on her porch. She wrote that she believed it had worked, that after she placed those objects in the basement in the way Aldous had described, the house went quiet. The hunger went dormant, not gone. She was always clear that it was not gone, but sleeping. The last entry in the journal was dated March 14, 1963. It said only, "I am going to stay. Someone has to stay, and make sure it keeps sleeping. God help the family that comes here when I'm gone." Nadia sat on the cold basement floor with the journal in her hands and understood everything. The objects had kept it sleeping for 50 years. Gerald Fitch had maintained them, kept them in place, kept the house cycling through short-term residents who left before it woke fully. But Nadia had moved in fast, and Fitch was old and tired and done, and now she and Ezra were in this house, and the thing inside it was awake, and it had already found her son. She stood up and went upstairs and pushed open Ezra's door. He was sitting up in bed, wide awake, looking at her. His eyes were clear. His expression was calm. Too calm. The kind of calm that had no business on a 9-year-old's face at midnight. "I know you went downstairs," he said. Nadia stood in the doorway. "Ezra, she said you'd go down there," he said. The temperature in the room dropped by several degrees in the space of a single second. "Who said that?" Nadia asked. Ezra looked at her with those too calm eyes. "The lady who lives here," he said. "She said don't worry. She said she just wants to keep me warm." Nadia crossed the room in 4 steps and took her son by both arms and looked directly into his face and said his name, hard and clear, the way she'd said it the first time he'd run into traffic at age 3. Something flickered in his eyes, a flash of her Ezra, the real one. "Mom," he said, and his voice cracked, and for one terrible clarifying moment, she saw the fear underneath the calm. "Mom, I can't." He stopped. His face went smooth again. "I'm tired," he said. "I want to go to sleep." She didn't let go of his arms. "Ezra, look at me." He looked at her, and in his eyes, behind the smoothness and the calm, she saw her son looking back at her from somewhere that felt very far away, like he was at the bottom of deep water, looking up. If your heart is hammering right now and you need to know how Nadia fights for her son against something that has been taking children for over 100 years, drop "Fight for Ezra" in the comments and hit that subscribe button, because episode 3 is where everything breaks open and not everyone makes it out the way they went in. Nadia did not sleep that night. She sat in the hallway, outside Ezra's room, with her back against the wall and Doris Hale's journal in her lap, and the crowbar she'd used to open the basement door beside her right hand. And she stayed awake until the gray early light of morning began to show under the hallway window, and the house settled into the particular quiet of dawn. Ezra slept. She checked on him every 30 minutes. Each time he was in bed, breathing, still. Each time she stood over him and watched his face and tried to find the seam between her son and whatever was wrapping itself around him. Each time she told herself she was going to get him out. She was going to get him out today, this morning, before whatever was happening to him went any further. At 6 a.m., she woke Mara, who had fallen asleep on the living room couch with her phone clutched to her chest. Mara was awake and alert within seconds, one of those people whose brain comes online like a light switch. Nadia handed her the journal. She went to make coffee while Mara read. By the time the coffee was done, Mara had finished. She sat at the kitchen table with the journal closed in front of her and said, in a voice that was very steady, "What did Reverend Aldous put in the basement?" "I don't know exactly," Nadia said. "She describes them as objects, things arranged in a specific way. She mentions the Bible. The other things I saw, I don't know what they mean or if they're all still intact." "We need to find out if there was ever another Reverend Aldous," Mara said, "if there's any record of what he knew and where he got it." Nadia nodded. "I also need to get Ezra out of this house today." "He'll fight it," Mara said quietly. Not as a challenge, just as a fact she'd already seen in the journal. The children always fought leaving. By a certain point, they wanted to stay more than they wanted anything else. Upstairs, she heard Ezra's door open, his footsteps in the hall, the bathroom door, the water running, the ordinary sounds of a boy waking up that she had taken for granted 10,000 times, and that now felt like a countdown she couldn't read. He came downstairs and sat at the kitchen table, and she made him eggs and toast, and he ate them, and said thank you, and looked like her son, almost entirely like her son. The eyes were still slightly off, still too still, but he was there. She kept looking for him and finding him, and each time she did, she felt a fierce, almost violent rush of love that steadied her hands. While he ate, she asked him casually if he'd like to go into town that morning, get out of the house for a bit, maybe find a bookstore. He looked up from his eggs. "I don't really want to go out," he said. "How come?" He thought about it, or something thought about it inside him. "I just want to stay here," he said. "It's nice here." "We'll just go for a little while," Nadia said. His expression flickered. That smooth, borrowed calm, showing its edge for just a moment. "I said I don't want to go," he said, and his voice was wrong. Too flat, too certain. Not the voice of a 9-year-old who didn't want to leave the house, but the voice of something that had decided he wasn't going to. Mara met Nadia's eyes across the table. An hour later, while Ezra was in his room, they drove into town. Nadia left Mara in the car and walked into the Harlow Creek Public Library, which was a small building on the main street that smelled of old paper and radiator heat. The librarian was a woman in her 60s named Dolores, who looked at Nadia with immediate recognition, the way people in small towns look at the new arrival in the house everyone knows about. Nadia asked about Reverend Aldous, about the church records from 1962, about any historical documentation of the land on which 14 Bellmare Road had been built. Dolores went very still. Then she said, "You found Doris's journal." It wasn't a question. "You knew about it?" Nadia asked. "Gerald Fitch told me about it years ago," Dolores said. "He came in and told me what was down there, and what Doris had done, and asked me to keep the church records from that period available, in case someone ever needed them." She paused. "I didn't think anyone ever would. Gerald was very good at making people leave." She brought out a folder from behind the desk. Inside it were photocopied pages from church records, handwritten notes on brittle paper, and 2 pages that appeared to be torn from a book whose title wasn't shown. The notes were in a cramped, urgent handwriting that Dolores identified as Reverend Aldous's. Nadia read them standing at the library counter. Aldous had known about the land before the Hales arrived. He'd known because he'd been told by the pastor before him, who had been told by the pastor before him, a chain of knowing that went back to the earliest settlement of Harlow Creek in the 1840s. The indigenous understanding of that land, which the earliest settlers had been told and had ignored, was that the ground in that particular spot had a nature to it that was neither malevolent nor benign in any human sense. It was simply hungry, and what it preferred, what it had always preferred, was the young. The unformed, children whose sense of self was still fluid enough that they could be absorbed into something else without the kind of resistance that adults would put up. Aldous wrote that the objects in the basement, arranged in the specific configuration Doris had placed them, acted as a form of anchor. They gave the hunger something else to fix on, something old and saturated enough with human feeling and intention to satisfy it temporarily, like feeding something raw meat to keep it from hunting. But they needed to be maintained, attended to, and they needed, crucially, to remain together and undisturbed. Nadia thought about the basement, the objects on the table, the Bible, the shoe, the journal she'd taken upstairs. She'd taken the journal. She'd removed it from the arrangement. The thing had been waking up for 11 days. She'd taken the journal last night. She'd broken whatever was holding it in check. She drove back to the house at 80 miles an hour. She could feel it before she got out of the car. The house felt different. The air around it felt closer. The oak trees in the front yard were completely still, despite a wind that was moving everything else on the street. The house sat on its lot in the cold October morning and looked back at her, and she had the absolute certain feeling, the kind that bypasses rational thought entirely and goes straight to the animal center of the brain, that the house was aware of her. She went inside.
"Ezra!"
She called. Silence. She went upstairs. His room was empty. His bed was made, which he never did on his own. His sketchbook was open on the desk. She looked at it. He'd drawn the house again, from the same angle as before, backyard looking up at his window. But this time the figure in the window was different. This time it was large, adult-sized, and it wasn't looking out. It was looking down. "Ezra," her voice cracked on his name. "In here," he said. The sound came from the end of the hallway, from the closed door at the far end that she'd always assumed was a linen closet and had never opened, because every time she'd gone to open it, something had pulled her attention away at the last moment. Something she'd thought was coincidence. She understood now that it wasn't. She walked to the end of the hallway. She put her hand on the door. She opened it. It wasn't a closet. It was a small room, barely larger than a walk-in wardrobe, with no window and no light. Ezra was sitting in the center of the floor, with his legs crossed and his eyes closed, and his hands open on his knees, perfectly still, in a posture that no child sat in naturally, in a posture that looked practiced and deliberate and taught. "Ezra," Nadia said. He didn't open his eyes. She went to him and crouched in front of him and took his face in both hands. His skin was cold, not the cold of a child who had been in a cold room, the cold of something that had moved through him and left a temperature behind. His face under her hands was still as stone. "Ezra Voss," she said. She said his full name, and his eyes flew open. He looked at her. He was in there, behind whatever was sitting in that small room, using his body like a chair. He was in there, and she could see him, and he could see her, and in his eyes she saw pure terror and pure love in equal measure, and she thought, "There he is. There is my son." "Mom," he said, in a voice that was his, and only his. "Mom, it's so cold. I can't." His face contracted. "It keeps getting louder. It keeps—" He stopped. Nadia pulled him to his feet. "We are leaving," she said, "right now. We are walking out of this house right now." "I can't," he said. His voice was fracturing between himself and something else. "It says I can't." "It doesn't get to say," Nadia told him. "I say, and I say we're leaving." She pulled him into the hallway. He came. His feet moved, but she could feel the resistance in him, like a current pulling against her, like trying to walk upstream, and it was getting stronger with every step toward the stairs. She thought about Doris Hale, about a woman who had stayed in this house for 11 years alone after her children were gone, keeping the hunger fed with objects and prayers and her own presence, her own grief, her own fierce insistence on staying between the house and whatever family came next. She thought about what that had cost Doris. Every year, every season, the price of being the one who stayed. She thought about the journal on the kitchen table downstairs. She pulled Ezra down the stairs. He was shaking now, trembling against her side, and she could hear the house around them shift and groan in a way that was not any settling or any pipe, in a way that had direction and intention and frustration. The front door was at the end of the entrance hall, 20 feet, 15, 10. Ezra stopped. His whole body stopped all at once, like something had grabbed him. He was not resisting her with his own muscles. Something had him. She could feel it. She was holding his wrist, and she could feel the pull in his arm, going in the opposite direction from where she was pulling him, toward the back of the house, toward the kitchen, toward the basement door that still stood open. "Ezra," she said. She turned him to face her. She held his face. "Look at me. Look at my face. You know who I am." He looked at her. His eyes were filling with tears, which meant he was still there, which meant there was still time. "You are Ezra Voss," she said. "You are 9 years old. You like drawing and dinosaur pancakes, and you are afraid of moths, but you pretend you aren't. You have a loose tooth on the bottom left that you've been wiggling for 3 weeks. You are my son, and I am your mother, and this house does not get to have you." The tears ran down his face. His arm stopped pulling away. "Walk," she said. He walked. She got him out the front door and across the porch and down the steps and onto the lawn in the cold October morning air, and didn't stop until they reached the car where Mara was standing, with the doors already open, already ready, because Mara had understood before any of them had the words for it. She put Ezra in the back seat. She buckled his seatbelt herself, her hands steady, because they had to be. She looked at his face. Color was coming back into it. His eyes were becoming his again, fully his, the specific warm brown of them that she knew better than her own reflection. "Mom," he said. "I've got you," she said. "What was it?" he asked. She thought about how to answer that. About Doris Hale and Reverend Aldous and a hunger that was older than the town that had grown up around it. About the names behind the wallpaper. Thomas, William, Clara. about the shoe on the table in the basement. One small brown leather shoe that had belonged to a child named William, who had been afraid of thunder. About all the families who had come to 14 Bellmare Road looking for a fresh start and had left carrying absences that never filled. Something old, she told him. Something that should have been left alone a long time ago. She closed his door. She went around to the driver's side. She looked back at the house one final time. In the upstairs window, in the window of Ezra's room, something looked back at her. Not Ezra, not anything she had a name for, just a presence, a dark still weight behind the glass, watching her go. And she understood in that moment what Doris Hale had understood 60 years ago. It wasn't angry. It didn't feel anything in any way she could recognize. It was simply patient. It would wait. It had always waited. The next family would come eventually, drawn in by an impossible price and a listing that had been on the market too long. And it would simply begin again. She got in the car. She started the engine. Mara looked at her from the passenger seat. "Where are we going?" "Away," Nadia said. They drove down Bellmare Road and didn't look back. The oak trees in front of the house were still. The house sat exactly where it had always sat, in the thin October light, warm amber, and beautiful and patient as stone. 3 weeks later, the listing for 14 Bellmare Road reappeared online. 4 bedrooms, 1.5 bathrooms, original hardwood floors throughout. Price to move quickly. Nadia saw it on a Thursday evening, sitting cross-legged on the floor of her sister's guest bedroom, with her laptop on her knees, and Ezra asleep behind her. She looked at the listing for a long time. Then she did the only thing she could think to do. She shared the listing to every local community group she could find, and in the caption, she wrote only this: "Do not buy this house. Do not take your children there. The price is not a deal. It is a cost you will not understand until it is too late. Some hungers do not die. Some things do not stop. And some houses are only ever borrowed by the families and by the thing that lives there and has been waiting, quietly, for the next ones to arrive." She didn't know if anyone would listen. She suspected most people wouldn't. Desperation is loud, and warnings from strangers are easy to dismiss, and $62,000 is $62,000. But she wrote it anyway, because Doris Hale had stayed in that house for 11 years so that the next family might have a chance to leave. And Nadia understood now that the least she could do was make sure the next family had heard the warning, even if they chose not to take it. She closed the laptop. She looked at Ezra, sleeping behind her. He'd been sleeping well since they left. No more midnight laughter. No more too calm eyes. His tooth had finally fallen out the week before, and he'd put it under his pillow and gotten $3 from the tooth fairy, and been delighted in the specific, uncomplicated way that only children can be delighted, with their whole body and no reservation. And Nadia had sat at the edge of his bed, watching it, and felt something unlock in her chest that had been sealed shut since the moment she first heard him laughing in the dark at 14 Bellmare Road. He was back. He was entirely, completely, unreservedly back. She didn't know if there would be a next family. She didn't know if her warning would reach anyone in time. She didn't know if the objects in the basement were still arranged the way Doris had left them, or if her removal of the journal had disturbed something that couldn't be restored. She didn't know what Reverend Aldis's text had been, or where it could be found, or if anyone alive still had access to the knowledge that might permanently end what lived in that house. What she knew was this: some dangers disguise themselves as answers. The things that seem too good to be true in moments of desperation are worth examining twice. The price that seems impossibly low always has a cost hidden somewhere in the fine print. And the most important thing a person can hold on to, when something old and hungry and patient tries to absorb what matters most, is the exact specific weight of the person they love. Not in general, not in principle, the specific weight. Ezra, with his drawings and his dinosaur pancakes and his moth phobia he was too proud to admit, the concrete, irreplaceable truth of someone you know so well that nothing else can convincingly wear their face. That is what brought him back. Not courage, though courage was part of it. Not strength, though she'd used every ounce she had. Just the absolute refusal to accept a version of her son that didn't include his loose tooth and his sketchbooks and the specific way he slept curled tight when the world felt too large. The house would wait. It always waited. But on that night, in her sister's guest room with Ezra's slow breathing behind her and the October dark pressing softly at the windows, Nadia Voss let herself believe that waiting was all it was ever going to do to her family again. And for the first time in weeks, she slept. Some places carry weight that predates every map drawn of them. Some hungers are older than the names we give to things. And some warnings, written by frightened women in quiet rooms, are the bravest things ever put to paper. If this story stayed with you, if Nadia and Ezra's fight to leave that house left something sitting in your chest that won't quite settle, then you already understand what makes horror real. It isn't the monster. It's the love that refuses to let go, even when everything is pulling it apart. Thank you for watching The Dark Chronicles. Leave a light on tonight.